Hello and welcome everyone to the quarterly Onshape review live stream. We're super excited to have you. For those not familiar, my name is Cody Armstrong. I'm the Senior Director of Onshape AI Innovation in the Onshape team here at PTC. And as always, I'm very fortunate to be joined by our Head of Product here at Onshape, Greg Brown.
Thanks, Cody. It's great to be back again. I know we've got a big show for today.
This is definitely going to be an exciting one, and I think a lot of our users are going to be thrilled by the things they see in today's live stream. So I'm really excited, and without further ado, let's dive right into things. So we always want to start with the agenda and give you a brief description of why we're here, what we're doing with these live streams, and what we really want to accomplish is give you not only the what we've done over the last few months, but also the why. What was the reason for some of these improvements? What was the underlying logic behind some of the decisions made that you're using day to day with Onshape? And so we want to give a little bit more context than you would typically get in a What's New forum post, for instance, a little bit more depth and a little bit more conversation about those improvements. Of course, that will involve discussing the what has improved in Onshape. We're going to go through that in great detail. Also with demos of our favorite improvements. That's always our favorite part of these presentations. But also give you a little bit of depth as to the why, the context as to the why, and some of the decisions behind some of these new features that were added to Onshape and what they mean in terms of the bigger picture. And I think that's what we hope to accomplish with these live streams, is give you a little bit more insight into what we're thinking with the last few months. So let's dive into what we've done so far. And this is taking a step back and looking at the entire year. And if you're new to Onshape, Onshape releases roughly every 3 weeks, which means so far in 2025, we've had 13 releases in 1 year so far, in the first 9 months. And in fact, we have 4 more releases left before the end of the year, which is crazy to think about. And the thing I would say about this list is this is only a small piece, a small glimpse of actually what was shipped in each one of these releases. We just cherry picking a handful of our favorites and putting them into a graphic here for you, but there are many more.
And what this list probably doesn't also, just a quick glance like this doesn't tell you the story arc of some of these things, that follows through multiple releases. We're building up certain things in certain ways. And it's really, really exciting to be able to do that on a 3 weekly basis. So it's just, we're going to show you what Cody said is a cherry-picked examples of the really good things from the last quarter. But believe me, there's a lot of depth to this, as well as the length of this timeline.
Yeah. And just to illustrate kind of the frequency and cadence of a release, we hit our 200th release during this window of time. So 200 different launches of Onshape, and no disruption. And that's the thing that I always like to remind users is that you're not doing anything, right? 200 releases and really no disruption to the end user as a result. So really exciting stuff, long list of things to go through. So let's dive into this quarter in particular. So this is looking at the entire 2025, but we're focused on the last quarter. And so in the context of the last quarter, I would say the theme of the last quarter has really been a dramatic increase in momentum across the board. And there's lots of new exciting features. And in fact, if I had to, make a suggestion for this presentation, it's wait till the end, because the end is going to be awesome. And I promise you that if you wait to the end, you will be blown away with some of the new awesome things that we're going to show. But the big thing that I would stress again is just that everything is improving. So there's increase in momentum in drawings, in assemblies, in rendering and simulation. So it's not just the depth of each feature, but the breadth of things that you can do with Onshape. So an exciting moment in Onshape's history, because that gas pedal is really to the floor, and you're going to see lots of even more improvements over the next few months as we finish off 2025. So the last slide I want to just emphasize here is that a lot of what we're focused on and a lot of what you saw in the last quarter were major new pieces of functionality. And Greg's going to go through a handful of them later on in today's presentation. Things that we've really done that are distinctly Onshape, done them in a distinctly Onshape way. But the thing I would really stress is there were improvements across the board. So I just put together a real simple graphic showing the momentum over just the last few months of the number of improvements. And you can see drawing improvements were huge. CAM improvements were huge. Render Studio, lots of Render Studio improvements. And then just tons of improvements to what you might classify as core modeling. But the important thing to stress is that it's going in all directions simultaneously, right? And we're focused in lots of different areas to improve that experience that you have, and not just the depth of features and the depth of things that you can do, but the breadth of them as well, right? Rendering, simulation, expanding on those capabilities really does lead to an increase in that momentum. So that's what I really wanted to emphasize as we dive into things is that we're going to cherry pick, as we always do, a handful of our favorite improvements. But the thing to go look at is the what's new post or the change logs if you really want to deep dive into every feature that was added over the last few months. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to jump right into things and start small.
Let's go.
Start with quality of life. And I think that for a lot of users, these are you might classify them as smaller improvements, but they're things that really do make a difference every day. And they're things that you have been asking for a long time that might not be large new capabilities, but they affect you every single day. And so I've picked out a handful of these that I think are really important. I think that users will really appreciate. And again, we're just cherry picking a handful. But I think the updated documents page is the one that I would really highlight the most. It gives you a condensed view, a means of looking at not only the folder structure that you may have, but also the documents within that. And it just means that it makes navigating that structure much easier. Also, for those out there using pipe taps, we now have a straight pipe tap. That was one of the most requested whole feature improvements that we've seen for some time, and now it's there. And it's a small thing, but for those doing straight pipe taps, that is a really big improvement in whole feature. Another one that I think is a small quality of life, but I think a lot of users will really appreciate, is the ability to go back into sketch pattern in full editing mode. And that was one that I think a lot of users really expressed a lot of appreciation for. Is in the past, you could always tweak, sketch pattern variables and the definition, but going back into that full edit mode was not possible, but now it is. And I think that a lot of users who do a lot of sketch patterns really do appreciate these things. And these are what I would define as small but important quality of life improvements for the everyday user just using Onshape and interacting with it all day. Now, those are some of the small quality of life improvements, but as we get through things, they start to get bigger and bigger in terms of scope. And so my next topic is PDM. And there are a handful of areas or improvements in the area of PDM that I think are really noteworthy. In particular, copy link to a release candidate. You can now send someone a direct link to a release candidate without having to explain to them how to navigate to it. They can go directly to it just via a URL, which is a really big improvement for those communicating in the release process. Custom library folder improvements, that was a really big one. Sheet metal form tools and frame profiles now can have nested structures, allowing you a lot more depth in defining both the frame profile libraries and your form libraries. Document notes, one of my personal favorites. A generic tool where you can add any kind of notes you want associated with a document and store it within that document. Something I think a lot of users will really appreciate. Markup and reply and comments, seems like one of those smaller ones, but I think when you really dive into it, it's a big deal. And a lot of users will really appreciate the ability to not only, create new comments associated with markups and so on, but actually be able to reply with those same details. And then finally, Onshape government connection now supports a connection to Arena PLM Enterprise AWS GovCloud. And so that gives our customers a true GovCloud supported instance on both the Onshape side and the Arena PLM side. So it's in a really exciting moment for that connection as well. So these are just a handful of the PDM improvements. I'm going to go on and I'm going to jump into Onshape in just a moment. I'll give you examples of some of these as well as we dive into them. But the next topic I really wanted to bring up in this, kind of smaller class of improvements before we get into some of the bigger things that Greg has planned is the improvements to configurations. Now, if you're a heavy user of configurations, you're probably a big fan of the configuration input changes that we made earlier this year. I believe it was in January. What we've done is steadily make improvements to configurations in a number of different places over the last few months that I think will make a meaningful impact for those building, especially the more complex configurations, the condition-dependent configuration inputs. That's a lot simpler and easier to use than it was in the past, and something I think a lot of users will appreciate. But also small things like dragging to reorder in the configuration panel. That's a big improvement and something that was necessary if you had a lot of inputs. Expand and collapse all, a small one, but a big one, especially if you have a long list of inputs. And then configuring sketch pattern instance count, just adding to that depth of sketch pattern improvements that we mentioned earlier. You can now configure those sketch pattern instances. So those are a handful of improvements to configuration that are noteworthy. Again, I'm going to come back to these in just a moment and show you a brief demo of a handful of them. The next topic I want to cover is CAM. And the reason I really like to stress CAM is this is the breadth, right, of our product. When we talk about simulation or rendering, CAM, we're really talking about going beyond kind of the traditional CAD and PDM functions that people normally associate Onshape with. And what we really want to emphasize here is we're adding to these things constantly. So you're going to see improvements from rendering, you're going to see improvements in simulation, but we also have improvements in CAM. And one of the most noticeable improvements is the user interface. You're going to see a visible change in the user interface between what we had in January, February when we first launched to where we are today. And that's just meant to make it more aligned with the Onshape user experience, make it more cohesive with everything else you're used to using in Onshape. But also other improvements, progressive selection filters really make selecting hole patterns and things like that very simple. And then also improvements to general performance, and then many, many more machines. If you're a CAM user, you know post processors and machine libraries are an ongoing thing, and we're constantly building new machines and new posts into CAM Studio. But lots of improvements to CAM, and it's something I really want to stress because it highlights that breadth of improvements that we're focused on. The final topic that I'm going to cover here today is drawings. And there are really a lot of improvements I could mention around drawings. If you saw the graphic earlier, it was by far the winner if you counted on a per improvement basis over the last quarter. There are really two, just for time's sake, that I want to highlight because I really do think they're kind of game changers in the drawings workflow for a lot of users out there. I really recommend, if there's one area to dive in deeper, drawings is definitely it if you want to dive in and start to dig into some of the other improvements in drawings. But call out highlighting and the ability to insert named views that support sections are two big improvements of the last few months that I think every user will appreciate. All right, so I'm going to dive into Onshape here, enough slides, and I want to start with some of these improvements. And I want to start with some of the quality of life improvements I mentioned just a moment ago. And I think one of the most obvious will be immediately recognizable to anyone who signs into Onshape. Your documents page looks different. And what we wanted to do is condense the information and give you more data in a single place. And so now we have a both upper half and a lower half, one displaying the folders in this case, and the bottom half displaying the documents. And the idea here is just more information available at any moment. We've also made some changes to allow you to add and remove properties from the document list. We also have the ability to mouse over the thumbnails that are a little bit smaller now as a result to give you much bigger thumbnails. And the idea is to give you more information, to make it more accessible from that early documents page without having to drill down into lots of layers to find the thing that you're looking for. And so the documents page rework, while it's a small change, a quality of life change, it's something you'll immediately notice. And I think a lot of users really appreciate the ability to navigate their document without having to go through lots of nested structures first and so on. And then have two distinctly different ways of looking at folders versus documents and so on. Lots of small changes in the documents page, the ability to add properties and things like that, the ability to have a larger thumbnail. But the bigger change I would highlight is just that ability to see both the documents and the folders at the same time and be able to navigate those two simultaneously. So that's one of the most noticeable quality of life changes that you will see early on when you first sign in after that update. Now, the next one I want to mention, this is not one that will apply to everyone, but I think for those that it will apply to, you'll be cheering it on because there are lots of users out there who need what we refer to as a straight pipe tap. And we've had taper pipe taps for some time, but in the whole feature, you will now find a straight pipe tap. And it sounds simple, but again, that was a big improvement, a small quality of life change in terms of broader big picture. But if you're using straight pipe taps, you know that that was a struggle in the past, right? You had to manually construct a lot of these or do other different techniques. Now it's built into whole feature. Just choose the straight pipe tap, choose your thread type and size, and then place it just like you would any other whole feature. So very cool, a quality of life improvement for sure. Everyone out there, using whole feature that needed straight pipe taps, you now have it and no longer need to do any kind of workarounds to make that happen. So an exciting one for sure for anyone using pipe taps. The next topic I'd like to get into is PDM. And there are a handful of PDM improvements that I think are really noteworthy. And I'm just going to jump into the gas drill, so bear with me for just a moment. But what I really want to highlight here are a handful of improvements, not just to release management, which is the case, that one of the biggest is to release management, but also just general PDM practices. The two that really strike me are document notes and the ability to mark up, because they're not necessarily perfectly aligned with PDM, but they definitely are in that realm of data management. And so I'm throwing them together here because I think they make sense in this context. So I want to start with the release management change. And I think the big one that a lot of people will really appreciate is the ability to just send someone a link to a release candidate. And this is something that we've been asked many times from users. I just want to be able to send someone a URL and they can see the release candidate without having to navigate to it or explain how to get to it. You can now do that. You can copy a link by just right-clicking the release and the versions in history. Or if you're in the release, you're going to see a little link icon at the top. And if you click that, just like you would expect, if I drop this in, it's going to take me directly to that release candidate. So it's a really effective way of sending someone a release candidate and saying, hey, look at this for whatever reason they have to look at it. But again, copy link, you'll see it in the right-click menu in the versions in history, but you'll also see it when you're in a release as well. So that is copy link. The next improvement I really wanted to point out, this is one of my personal favorites in this quarter, in the last quarter, is just document notes. And I like this one because it's so general purpose. You can have a lot of different applications for this. And so I stress this only because in this example, I'm showing you, something that gives you a little bit more depth and explanation as to all the configured parameters that exist in this particular part studio. This is a pneumatic cylinder. And if I expand out, you can see it has lots of configured inputs. And so I want to explain what those inputs do, right? In a little bit more depth. Well, document notes are a great example of that. But you can think of it really as just a place to jot down notes, right, associated with that document. And then the big thing there is that if you have some application where you're trying to convey information inside of it that's contextually relevant to the document, this is the place to do that, right? Everyone can see it. And now in this example, at least, I could have a novice user open it up and understand immediately what all the values are, even if they don't, logically make sense in terms of the name. So document notes, huge improvement in my opinion. It's an open-ended thing, so you can use it in whatever way you see fit. I'm showing you one example up here. There's probably hundreds of different examples where you might use document notes as a means for storing information relative to the document. But it's general purpose, and I think that's what users really appreciate most about it. All right, so one of my final PDM improvements that I want to mention here is the ability to mark up in a replied comment. So this is one of those, again, quality of life improvements, but in the context of data management, oftentimes what we want to do when we're communicating in a comment is be able to use the same markup tools and other tools that we're used to when creating a comment to also to reply to them. That is now the case. So when you hit reply, you're going to see those same markup tools that you're familiar with. And when creating a comment, you can use when replying to a comment as well. And that's something I think a lot of users will appreciate because, again, it allows you to have that fidelity and it's just consistent user experience across the comments. So those are a handful of the improvements in the PDM realm that I wanted to highlight. My next topic is configurations. Now, for those that have been following configurations for some time now, you may know that we've done a lot of really unique things in configurations this year. Not necessarily the last quarter. The last quarter has been improvements to them. But over the last year, we've really added some exciting things around configurations. And so one of the first things I'd like to highlight is, this is a small one, but I think really important if you have a lot of inputs, the ability to drag to reorder your inputs, right? So now I'm grabbing, in this case, a Boolean, a simple input that defines whether this has a rod clevis. I'm dragging it above the rod clevis definition, right? And so these are two different inputs. One just says what type of rod clevis is it, and this says, does it have a rod clevis at all? My point in this is it makes more sense for the rod clevis definition to be above where the type of rod clevis definition is. And that's where dragging to reorder makes a lot of sense. In general, it's just as you create configuration inputs, they come in the order they originally defined. But that may not necessarily reflect the order that you want to visually see them in, or see them in the graphics. And by the way, when you do change them in the configuration panel, of course, they change over here as well. And so you can see now I have rod clevis here, and I have the type below it. But again, the big thing to stress there is just the ability to reorder them in a way that makes sense. Now, another one, this is a small one, admittedly, but I think a lot of users who are heavy configuration users will really cheer this on, is the ability to both collapse and expand all inputs simultaneously. And I think that one is one that a lot of people, I can imagine just people clapping in the background, even though it's such a small thing, is it, if you have 30, 40 inputs and you have them all expanded out at once, going through and collapsing them could be, a rather tedious thing. And so it's consistent with other places in the Onshape interface and user experience, and something I think a lot of users will really, really appreciate. Now, the last comment I would have on configurations in particular is just the ease with which you can define input visibility. And if you're not familiar with it, I believe in the first release of the year, we added the ability to define input visibility for configurations. What that essentially means is, the configuration input, its visibility is defined by some other condition. And so in this example, if you're not familiar with this notion, in this example, I have rod clevis as a checkbox. That means that, in this cylinder configuration, that either has a rod clevis or it doesn't. Well, this is dependent on this. If this is checked, this should appear. But if this is not checked, it should not. That's a conditional input. And we've had this for some time. We've had it as early as the first release of the year. What we've done in the last few months is make it dramatically easier to use. And that's the thing I would really stress is when you go in to modify the visibility conditions, this icon here, it's a lot more human friendly and readable than it was in the past. You had to know, a little bit more syntax and definition to get this right in the past. Now it's very simple. I can say, well, here's my rod clevis input. I want to make the type dependent on this. So I hit add condition, very human readable way. I can say, well, I want the rod clevis true, and only if the rod clevis is true should this input be visible. And so again, just making it easier to interact with these more conditional, complex situations. So now that input is hidden until I check the box for rod clevis, and now that input is visible. But again, the big improvement there is just the ease with which you can do that. We've had the ability to do that for some time, but the ease with which you can do it is the big improvement for sure. All right, so the next topic, the next category for me is CAM. And I really want to stress CAM has gotten a lot of improvements, but a lot of them are in areas like performance and machine library and tool definitions. And so there are things that aren't necessarily completely visible, the things you interact with every day, but they're not necessarily new icons and functionality. There are a handful of new icons and functionality that I really think are noteworthy and I'd want to point out. The first is just a dramatic change in terms of the interface. The toolbar looks different. And if you used Cam Studio 6-8 months ago when we first launched, you'll notice that it's much more consistent with Onshape's user experience. And we're trying to constantly make tweaks to make improvements in not only Cam but simulation, rendering, all the areas that categorize kind of the breadth of our product. And this is just one more example of that, bringing that consistency to Cam, that kind of Onshape user experience to Cam. And so the toolbar, you'll see inserting parts, creating jobs, creating machines, creating setups. The look and feel of these look very much like Onshape and less like a distinctly different thing. So that's one of the most important pieces. And it's not just the toolbar, but it's also things like the component icons and little things throughout the interface that are meant to make it more consistent with Onshape. Now, the other thing that I would highlight, one of my favorite improvements in Cam in the last few months is the progressive selection filters for Cam. And I think this is really important for those doing really complex like hole patterns where you have lots and lots of hole definition, and going through and defining them manually can be this tedious task. And so in this situation, let's say, for instance, I want to define some holes. What we have here is a new option, two new options technically, for select all blind holes and select all through holes. And essentially, this is a selection filter that you can enable that allows you to grab all the blind holes in one single click. right? And that's what's so cool about it is, and if you caught it there, but I turned on select all blind holes. I move my mouse over the geometry and it automatically highlights all the blind holes in the part, right? And so going from, having no holes toolpath generated to generating, dozens or hundreds of holes just using these selection filters can be very fast. And that's the thing I really like to stress is, I'm not going through and individually selecting a whole bunch of edges or defining holes manually. I can just say, grab all the blind holes, right? And it will automatically generate toolpath for those. So again, the progressive selection filter, something I think a lot of users using CAM every day will appreciate. It just saves you from that tedious step of having to manually select those holes. All right, so those are the improvements in CAM. My final topic for today is drawings. And I think there's a whole bunch of things I could talk about here. I mentioned this before, and I showed that graphic earlier. Drawings by far got the sheer volume of improvements over the last few months. But there are two that I really think are game changers everyone should be aware of. And I think that they affect almost everyone using Onshape today, and that's really why I want to highlight them. And that is the ability to use named section views or named views with sections in drawings and call out highlighting. And so I want to demonstrate both of these just briefly here for a moment. So bear with me. We have in named views, let's just go back and get out of a section view. And so here I have an axle. And in this axle assembly, I have a named view. And this named view also includes section information. And so for those not familiar, you can create named views with sections and it maintains that section view state. The most important thing to remember about this is you can create really complex section views in the assembly or part modeling environment using combinations of entities and so on. And you can capture all of that with named views. The limitations of the past were that you could not insert those into the drawing. And that is no longer the case. And so in this case, I have a named view, I believe it's called named section view. But if I create a drawing, let's just create a new drawing. And I go to insert that. The most important thing is when you insert that named view, it will respect the section view cuts that are there for it. And the reason I think this is so important is it kind of offloads the section view work to the part or the assembly, right? Where you may have more control, you may prefer to store it there anyway. And so in this case, you can see named section view. That's my named section view I showed you just a moment ago. But the most important detail, let's make this just a little bit bigger so you can see. The most important detail is the fact that it's capturing that section view state upon insertion, right? And so you can create these complex section views at the part studio or the assembly level and just repurpose them in the drawing. And that's the way I would think of it. That's the important thing I would stress is there's lots of applications for this, so I don't want to narrow it to a specific one. But I think in this situation, if you're, of the habit of, I create a certain name view with a handful of parts and it's sectioned in certain ways, you can capture all of that and reuse it in the drawing. And that's what this improvement really gives you. Now, the last improvement that I have to mention, I think is one of the biggest, and it's subtle, but it's big. And I think for a handful of reasons, I really want to take a moment to stress this. I'm going to insert a bill of materials. Let's just insert the top level bomb, put it in the corner. And what I want to do is, of course, add some callouts, right? So we'll add some balloon callouts. Let's tag them here and just real simple assembly drawing of the top level, right? Nothing complicated. But the important thing I really want to stress here is what we refer to as callout highlighting. And the reason I think this is such a big deal is it allows people who are unfamiliar with the drawing or even the details of the assembly that's in the drawing to very quickly visualize what it is, right? And so let me show you what this is. Again, very subtle, so you have to look closely. But when you mouse over a line item in the BOM, it will highlight in the graphics what that thing is, right? Sounds really simple, but keep in mind, if you built this drawing, it's very easy to understand what those things are. But if you sent this to someone view only, and they're not at all familiar with it, it's easy for them to just navigate through, just literally moving the cursor up and down through the BOM. It highlights the various pieces of geometry, and it makes it really easy to convey what those things are, right? And I think that's the really important thing. Of course, it highlights the balloon associated with the line item. I think that's, it's very important, of course, and I think that is, something that's expected. to me was really neat is the highlighting of geometry associated with it, because now even if you don't have it call out in the bloom, even if it's highlighted in other places, it's very easy for even a novice or someone who's not experienced to just move their mouse through the BOM, highlight all of the individual parts or subassemblies that exist within it, and have a really clear understanding of what's what, right? And I think that's the area. That's one of the improvements that I would really highlight. It's a small thing, it's a subtle thing, but if you're sharing drawings with others and they don't have that inherent knowledge of all the various subassembly names and so on, this just makes it so much easier to navigate that drawing and understand the various pieces of it. So that is my piece, and I'm going to turn things over to Greg.
All right, Cody, thanks for that. There was a huge breadth and depth of things you covered there already, from the quality of life through to some of these, more in-depth things as well there with CAM and drawings and configurations and PDM. But I want to, switch the topic back to some core modeling things. And there's a really, really big one we're going to start this off with. Now, we call this the query variable. We introduced this in the only 2 releases ago. Query variable changes the game for something that every single CAD user has to do, which is make selections. In fact, query variables create parametric selections that other features can use downstream. And again, as I said, this is something that every single CAD user has to do. And we've made this significantly easier. It's changing the game with how you create feature lists, which are actually simple to read. In fact, capture the design intent so much better than just lots and lots of individual selections. These selections you make will update predictably and robustly. The selections can include things like vertices and edges and faces and whole bodies. And if there is not a built-in query that and then I'll show you a few of them in a second, it's very, very simple to create your own custom query variables as well. So with that, let's actually turn over and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. Let's start with something like this, and then I'm going to wind it back to some simpler example as well. But in this wheel, which is nearly finished, you'll see that there's a lot of sharp edges that I'd like to take the edges off with something like a chamfer feature. Now, this wheel, as you'd expect, is parametrically updatable. We've got a lot of configurations, either the number of bolt holes in the lugs here. And in doing so, when I change this, you'll see that the number of sharp edges changes drastically as well. So in the old days, what you would have to do is you'd go around and pick all of these sharp edges, hoping that you wouldn't miss one. What we can do now in Onshape is create a query variable. Now, query variable is up here next to the other variable because it's same. And in the query variable, you can actually do things like choose all parallel edges or fillet faces or all faces produced by a protrusion or in a pocket, all those sorts of things. But there's a really important one for this case that I'm talking about now, which is edge convexity. I can find all of the convex or sharp outside shapes like this, or inside sharp edges as well, or even I'm looking for edges that have got smooth connections between them. With that, I create a single variable that I've called sharps, and then I can use that downstream. And you'll see when I create this chamfer here, instead of having a million different picks, I've actually just got a single entity because I've chosen it from this query variable that I've chosen. And you see here, it's got the hashtag, the variable annotation that we've used in our other sorts of variables as well. So, with doing this, I can go back and change this to my 4 lug hole example, and you'll see that there's no errors here. The feature tree is robustly updating according to these topological changes because that query is codified into the model that I've built. The intent is built in there, and the intent is really, really important. So here's a really, really simple example in case people have sort of seen this for the first time. I've created a through hole here, and I've created a small pattern from it. And now perhaps, again, I'm going to create a chamfer, and I'm going to choose these edges manually, the edges on both sides. Now, if I go back and change the pattern to, say, a 3x2 pattern, you'll see what happens is that the selections didn't update because I had just manually picked that. This is the old school way of doing things. So yeah, the old school, I would have had to recognize the error, come in and edit these pick. So fortunately, that's not the way that it has to be done anymore. I can create a single query variable here. And in this case, I'm going to use a little bit more sophisticated one, which is a created by. So I'm looking for all of these types of entities, which in this case is going to be an edge, created by, and I'm going to choose here the features that created these edges. For instance, the 10 mil through hole and the pattern. So these two things constitute generating these edges. And now that I've got this as a variable called hole top edges, I can just use this in the chamfer instead. So it will make a new chamfer. And instead of picking, I'm actually going to use this selection, hole top edges, and they all update there. So you can see now we've automatically got that, regardless of what this pattern is going to do. Now, an interesting thing there is if I go back and change this query variable, I can show you a thing that we can do, which is add additional queries on top of that first query. Now, the additional query on this is to subtract certain other edges. So I'm going to use all of the edges created by the holes, except for the edges which are touching this face. Which means that, now I've just sort of chamfered and broken off these edges on the top face, but I've excluded these ones from the bottom. This is, again, capturing intent that otherwise would have been not visible to people if they just saw selection lists there before. Another example, I've got a few really nice quick examples here for query variable, since it is such an important and consequential feature that everyone, again, can benefit from. So here in this bearing, I've created this race, sort of the cage for the ball here. And it's actually going to be made up of a bunch of features, including some revolves and a Boolean extraction, or union, sorry. So if I go back to the point where I did this Boolean, normally what I would have done, and what you would normally do in CAD systems, is assemble the geometry that you want to Boolean together. Then you'd use the Boolean feature and just in one almighty sweep, choose all of those, right? And you can see all the selections in there. Now, you can imagine what the problem would be is if I changed the configuration of the bearing where I had slightly different number of ball bearings in the race there as well. So instantly, those sorts of selections would become out of date and in fact go into some kind of error. So with the query variable, what we can do is again uses the created by option. So I'm looking for, in this case, all the bodies that were created by the revolves and the circular pattern. So regardless of the configuration or the bearing designation that I've got, that Boolean will have the correct bodies in which it can go together. And I use that again at the end because I'm going to create, this is the bearing as it is in the second to last step. I've got all the different balls. I've got the outside, the inside race, and the cage. Now I'm going to create a composite part from all of this. And again, instead of creating a composite part and picking everything, I've actually got a query variable which gives me all solid bodies, regardless of when they've been created. At the point which I'm using this, which is at the bottom of the tree here, I'm actually just going to composite all bodies together. So again, I can change to different bearings. And of course, I'm going to end up with one solid composite part, which has got no errors in the feature tree. Another little example here, which is a little bit more abstract, I guess. I've got some curves, and you can see here the curves. I'll hide the surface. I've got these curves which have been derived in from another document. Now, maybe I've got this document over here, which is keeping all my favorite company logos in it. For instance, this one here. Now, what I want to do is project these curves onto some other face like this one here. Now, so far, so good. But if I have a look at the naive and the old school way of doing it, what I actually did here was just make this gigantic selection. You see there's a lot of curves that I've selected. Now, not only is this error prone because I might have missed a very, very short edge, it is also very hard for me to guess the intent if I was coming after somebody else who's done this. So what you can do now is replace that with a query variable, which again is saying, let's give me all of the edges, in this case, edges that were created by the derived feature. Now, this is super powerful because imagine you might be bringing in an as cast derived model, and then you're going to pick all faces or something from the abs cast and then do something with it. In this case, I'm just bringing in the logo and using all the edges. Now, there's an important thing here that I'm filtering out construction entities. I'm only just giving the solid entities there. And in my projected curve feature, instead of all of that, I'll just wipe all of that out and say, use the edges from this query variable. And there we go. Now, the benefit of this is that I can come back to that logo derived feature and say, well, let's use something else. And this is where it gets really exciting, because I can just choose something completely new like this. And the features that come after it are updating and are so flexible, so robust. And this is what parametric modeling, how parametric modeling should be, right? So these things, you can imagine, are going to really change the game. Now, there's one last example here, which is where you can create your own custom query. And in this case, there's a query that I couldn't find in the built-in list. So I went over and creating a custom feature in Onshape using our own feature script language, I created my own query, which is really, really simple. Actually, most of this could have been done in a single line. And my query for this was to collect all of the mate connectors which are owned by this one body. So that's my feature looks a bit like this. It creates a query variable, and then when I do a whole feature, for instance, I can use that custom query and the whole goes in perfectly. Now, if I again make some upstream changes and unsuppress a pattern, you'll see how that updates robustly, predictably, and reliably. All right. So query variable, it's for everybody, and it's so powerful. The next thing in the area of modeling is with surfacing. Now, there's a bunch of little small things to do with surfacing diagnostics and measurements like deviations, and which probably are just easier to show right here. So with Onshape, you can always do this curvature and surface analysis. So we use that tool there. I've got a shortcut I could also do for that. And you can get the grid, the control point grid for here. But you'll see the new thing is that I get a preview of the number of spans or the control points and the degree of the surface as I roll over. So that just gives you a little bit more insight into the diagnostics. Of course, you can turn the curvature combs on or off at the same time. And more than that, you can start adding other diagnostics all at the same time, like this deviation plot. See, you can see here, I'm blending out from a 0 degree up to a 40 degree. And you can keep building on that as well. Look, I can put zebra stripe diagnosis. I can do Gaussian curvature on top of all of this at the same time. So these are the incremental improvements we're making to these areas of surfacing diagnostics, which are so important to high quality surface design. The other thing is that it does work with curves, with spline curves here. I've got a nice spline, and I roll over it. I can see that it's a single span degree 3 spline in there as well. So all of the information that advanced surface modelers would be looking for. The other thing in here is a tool called curve deviation. I can choose 2 curves, and maybe this one here like this for the other curve. And it's going to give me a measurement of the deviation between these curves. And again, these sorts of measurements are just standard types of fare for advanced surface modeling. And we're happy to include more and more of these every release in Onshape. The last one in the surfacing area is a diagnostic for when you're using the enclose feature. Now, the enclose feature you can see here is in error deliberately, and it doesn't enclose everything that it needs to yet. So I can, if I edit it, you'll see very quickly it's highlighting the edges that are still open in the enclose, which means that I've forgotten to pick something, either a plane or another surface, in order to fully enclose this. Now, when you've got advanced and really advanced models, it sometimes has been tricky to see where those unenclosed areas are. So now this highlighting is going to be a lot of help for that. Now, talking over about some of the increase in breadth of our product area. So Render Studio is one of these things. So we've done a lot in the last few months. In fact, the year has been really good for Render Studio, but specifically over the last 3 months, we've added a bunch of stuff for dragging and dropping appearances onto the model so that it's really, really rapid to be able to set up something like you can see on the screen here in front of you. Without having to pick individual faces. We've actually changed the priority of how that picking would go. We've also support assembly folders, and the way that Onshape and Render Studio interact with each other is very, very similar and the same. Right. But the big one I want to quickly take you through is with panoramic rendering. Now, I've got this image here. This is a photograph, courtesy of a customer of ours here in Boston called AVI, that do high-end automotive modifications and other services around this. This is a detailing bay that they use for spotting flaws on surfaces and really, detailing to absolute perfection. This photo was provided, and what I did is I modeled the significant light sources in here. You can see these spots and these strips on the top. And there's a bit of reflectivity from the room. And the new thing in Onshape Render Studio is the ability to render this out as a panoramic EXR or HDR file. Now, EXRs and HDRs can be used in other rendering situations so that you can get the lighting or the effect of this lighting, but in any other setup or scene or scenario that you create, which is what's going on here. The lighting you're seeing here is coming from that EXR model that I generated in Render Studio. The model in the red thing in the middle is also created in Render Studio. So you can see the reflections and everything else. The background is that first photograph. So together you can get some really, really compelling images. And I'll just be able to change that very quickly because I'm in Render Studio. I can change colors. And of course, you can get the effect of changing the orientation of those lights as well. So, thanks to AVI, for providing these images. But this is a really exciting thing because product creation of these kinds of images, doesn't have to just be automotive. It can be for handheld products on a much smaller scale or however else you might want to create high quality renderings. In the area of simulation, moving right along here, we have included the ability to do what we call inertial relief. Now, inertial relief is a high-end sounding capability, but it's super, super easy to use because it really is just a checkbox. And you'll see here in the simulation setup, you can either check it on or off. Now, why would you use it? Inertial relief is really, really useful when certain situations occur where your part or subassembly or whatever happens to be moving and it's not fully constrained in an inertial frame of reference. So what you need to do in the traditional way is come up with a constraint arrangement, hold things in certain ways so that it doesn't move anymore. That's what linear static stress requires, things to be static. Or you can use inertial relief, which will automatically apply the body loads and the accelerations required to move this into an the inertial frame of reference. So a couple of examples here. The classic one is a conrod here. There's forces coming from each end, but there's no real constraint easy to see. That sounds an easy one to model with inertial relief. Same with the lower control arm here. You've got some forces coming down from the top from the springs and coming up from the spindle of the steering. This is an easy one to do with inertial relief as well. And of course, my favorite one here is the carabiner, which has got a rope pulling on each end and no other constraints other than these forces. So all of these are really, really easy to do now with inertial relief. Which brings me to the big one, and I hope you've been sticking around for this one. Now, the title of the slide might give it away, as well as the image. No, mirror assembly. It's one of these things that people have been asking for a long time. And yes, it's a core capability required in CAD. But something, when we were looking at the history of CAD, has been done not as well as we think it could have been. And it desperately needed reimagining or re-engineering, which is what we've done with the feature in Onshape. we've made it more robust, faster, more flexible, and again, more Onshape-y. Right. So let's have a look at that in the form of a demonstration here. So one of my models here is it's a little RC car. It's pretty complicated. Right? There's a lot going on, as they say. And if I have a look through here and do a quick cross section, you'll see that there is indeed a lot going on. This is fully articulated, suspension front and rear, and it's not finished. Obviously, we need to finish the right-hand side of it. What we can do now in Onshape is use the new assembly mirror command. The assembly mirror is very, very simple to use. We choose what we want to mirror, either by picking on the screen, or I'm actually going to choose the full front left corner here. I'm going to choose a plane to mirror across. I'm going to choose the middle of the model there. And it's telling me that some new instances will need to be created. There's asymmetry in here. So let's have a look at what it thinks it needs to do. You can see how fast this is. It's giving me this table which comprehensively shows me what it knows it can transform because they're symmetric instances versus things that it needs to derive a mirrored or a handed copy of. So here, the lower control arm here definitely is asymmetric, so let's create the right-hand version of that. But on the other hand, the spring, which you can see is cross-highlighting here, I'm actually going to not derive it, I'm actually going to transform the spring. I don't want to have a left-handed wound spring versus a right-handed wound spring. That's unnecessarily expensive. So we're going to just choose to transform that and override it. And you'll see how fast we can then create the rest of this subassembly. I didn't have time to complete my next sentence there. But anyway, so we've got now our right-hand front suspension. And you'll see that the good thing is that it's nice moving as it should, as a mirror. I will point out a couple of complications that we have been able to address with this. Firstly, this is not all coming from a single document. These are coming from multiple different documents. You can see the dotted line here refers to the spring is actually coming from its own document somewhere else. In fact, it's under release management. And as an additional complication, it's configured. Right? So all of these things on top of each other add up to a pretty complicated situation that we have to handle with this mirroring. The other one is that the wheel, this subassembly of the subassembly, is also coming from a different document. Right? So those are additional spicy complications that I've added to make life hard for myself. Well, not really, because it isn't very hard. I've also come across the fact that I forgot to mirror the back corner as well, so I can edit this mirror feature. It's fully parametric, associative, and editable and suppressible and all the good things that it should be. So I'm going to choose the left corner in as well. It quickly does the analysis again, and it tells me that it needs to create a mirrored image of some of these components there. You can see the ones in there. There's a few of them, so let's update that. And we'll have a look at the result there. Yep, okay. We're good. Now, if we have a look at the bill of materials, this is a really important thing that crosses back over into the world of PDM. And of course, with Onshape, PDM and CAD and assemblies are the same. Right? There's no two worlds. It is just one single world, the world known as Onshape. And you'll see here that the spring that I've highlighted, there's a single line item and a quantity of 4. Even though it's gone through these mirroring processes. So we're smart enough to not have to automatically or accidentally create new part numbers for something like this. Very, very important. Now, as the final thing here, what I'd like to do is change the configuration of the top level assembly. And remember, there's like 400 or 500 parts under this assembly. So this is not a trivial task, but you can see that the front spring can be configured to be the yellow variety. And you see here the mirror correctly updates to that. And you'll see that the spring, which was previously quantity 4, is now quantity 2 because the rear spring is a separate product number. It's actually got its own part number, its own SKU. So, you know, these sorts of things all working together with the mirrored assembly is making it such a powerful tool, and we're really, really excited to see how people are going to benefit from this. Again, you know, we said this we've been sitting on this one, been thinking about it for a long, long time to make sure that we get it right, and it's not just a blind copy of, and you know, copying of the mistakes people have done in the past. Now, as a final test, I wanted to have a look at. Oh, I'm running a little late. Let me just forward that a bit. One of my favorite assemblies here that I've probably shown people in the past is this. Again, it's not a it's non-trivial assembly, and it's got lots of good mechanisms, and you know, all of the gear ratios and everything is working nicely. So, what would happen if we just mirrored all of that? And it takes about 15 seconds to actually do that mirror. And you see here, this is looking pretty nice. So let's have a look at this, and I'll make some transparent parts so that you can see the mechanisms all mirrored. Now, not all of it needed to be mirrored. Some of it was transformable, so that's why it was fairly quick. These gears were also obvious transforms. But the fun thing was this. So, you know, in this parallel world, or this mirrored world, time does seem to travel backwards, but it does it in a robust and easy to do, easy to use, and very, very powerful way that you know, it smells and it smacks of Onshape. You know, really, really excited about this feature.
Cool. I love how you were off by 1 minute. That is precision. That is precision.
All right.
So I think that, you know, I'm hoping everyone in the audience is out there clapping right now, because I think that is one of the biggest improvements of the year, in my opinion. One of the most requested as long as I've been here. And the thing that I like to stress, Greg said it, is we've done it in a way that's unique to Onshape. And not just, you know, assembly mirror. Assembly mirror is obviously, you know, very unique to Onshape and its delivery, but also like the query variable and some of the other big improvements we've done there. We try to take that opportunity to rethink things and not just build a duplicate of what's already out there. I think that's a message that people really, really appreciate. But in general, you know, we are super excited about the last quarter. I think the last quarter is, you know, the momentum is definitely picking up, and some of these big ticket things are shipping, and people are super excited about it. So, but I'm just excited about the next quarter, and I think the last few months of the year are going to be really, really exciting. We have 4 more releases yet left, and we have another one of these presentations to give to you all. So we're really thrilled about it. I just want to remind everyone, there's a lot more to this. So we're only cherry picking a handful of improvements. I know you can't read what's on the screen here, but if you go to onshape.com/changelog, you can see in finite detail all the improvements that have happened with each release. Or if you go to the What's New forum post or What's New marketing page, you can read those details as well. But important to keep in mind, we've only just touched the surface of what we've covered here, just cherry picked some of our favorites, but definitely go and dive deeper if you're interested. So without further ado, we just have one more moment. I'm going to wrap things up. I want to wrap things up by saying thank you, everyone. The user community is fantastic. And as always, many of these improvements that you see here are inspired by you, are driven by you. And that's something that we very much appreciate. So your feedback is invaluable, and please continue submitting that feedback in tickets and on the forums, and help us shape the future of Onshape. So that's it, everyone. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks very much. Yeah.